In today's biased news, Bakhmut is taken, Republicans lead the U.S. into economic disaster, and the conflict in Sudan sees a small break. Yesterday, the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, formerly known as Artemovsk, was captured by Russian and Wagner troops, ending the longest and bloodiest battle of the 15-month war. Ukrainian forces are still holding onto a peripheral and, quote, insignificant part of the city, according to Ukrainian officials, as Russian airstrikes on the western edge and nearby military sites continue. Wagner's leadership has stated that they've accomplished all their objectives in the city, and are planning to leave the zone within days. Meanwhile, officials at the recent G7 summit in Japan announced that they will continue to support Ukraine in the conflict, with a meeting between Biden and Zelensky in Hiroshima resulting in further verbal commitments from the US to train Ukrainians in the use of American F-16 fighter jets. Biden stated that their deployment wouldn't have helped in Bakhmut, but could, quote, make a big difference in terms of being able to deal with what's coming down the road. In response, the Russian Foreign Ministry has stated that the implication of providing these jets to Ukraine would run, quote, colossal risks, further stating, "We see that Western countries are still adhering to the escalation scenario." The Russian ambassador to the US stated, quote, "There is no infrastructure for the operation of the F-16 in Ukraine, and the needed number of pilots and maintenance personnel is not there either. What will happen if the American fighters take off from NATO airfields, controlled by foreign volunteers?" End quote. Meanwhile, Ukrainian military officials continue their wonder weapon statements, this time stating that once F-16s are deployed, Ukraine will, quote, win this war. This continues a trend within the conflict in which diplomacy and regional security concerns are sidelined in favor of further commitments of military aid and weapons, which have emptied Western depots, strained tax-funded budgets in the EU and US, and prevent the return of normalcy that peace in Ukraine would bring. To reaffirm the lack of priority the US leadership applies to issues at home, such as unemployment and inflation, Biden has promised a new $375 million military aid package for Ukraine, as 500,000 Americans declare bankruptcy each year. In Palestine, the Israeli army has just killed 3 Palestinian men during a large-scale raid on the Balata refugee camp in the northern occupied West Bank. At least 7 other Palestinians were injured, including 4 by live ammunition, and dozens of others suffered from inhaling tear gas, according to the ministry. Hundreds of Palestinians turned out for the funeral procession on Monday afternoon for the 3 men killed. Warring factions in Sudan have agreed to a 7-day ceasefire following talks in the Saudi Arabian city of Jeddah, as fighting that has killed hundreds and displaced more than 1 million people entered its 6th week. The fighting between Sudan's army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces has plunged the country into chaos. Stocks of food, cash, and essentials are rapidly dwindling, and mass looting has hit banks, embassies, aid warehouses, and even churches. Over in the US, the Republican-led House is refusing to pay the country's debts unless Biden agrees to cuts in spending, new curbs on social programs, and reductions in future spending. If a compromise to raise the government's borrowing authority is not reached soon, the US risks losing its reputation as a stable anchor of the global economy. The consequences would include the delay of retirement and veterans benefits, and a potential recession with severe job losses. President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy are set to hold critical talks to avert an economic disaster. There are doubts about whether any deal between Biden and McCarthy could pass through Congress due to Republican demands and the narrow majority held by Democrats. The radical Reagan-esque stance taken by the House GOP on the debt ceiling is widely seen as a dangerous and hypocritical approach, as they showed willingness to raise the debt ceiling when they were in power. The dynamics of the standoff reflect each side's assumption that the other will bear the greatest political cost if the economy collapses due to default. The outcome of this showdown will have significant implications for the power dynamics in Washington. And as usual, normal people stand to suffer the most from the outcome. Continuing with the stuff made in other countries is a security risk trend of the new Cold War, after Montana became the first state to ban TikTok last week, China has declared that products made by US memory chip giant Micron Technology pose, quote, serious network security risks, and will be banned from key infrastructure projects in the country. This marks China's first major action against a US chipmaker as tensions between the two countries rise. Micron stated that it is evaluating the conclusion and is engaging in discussions with Chinese authorities. The US government condemned the restrictions, and has pledged to work with allies to address China's actions. While the ban is expected to have limited impact on Micron, which does not heavily rely on the Chinese market, this symbolic gesture might be a sign of what's to come, on both sides of the ocean. And in positive news of the day, at least for EU citizens, but also everyone who isn't a fan of Meta, the company was hit with a record €1.2 billion fine by the lead EU privacy regulator over its handling of user information, and given 5 months to stop transferring users' data to the United States. The fine, imposed by Ireland's Data Protection Commissioner, came after Meta continued to transfer data beyond a 2020 EU court ruling that invalidated an EU-US data transfer pact. It tops the previous record EU privacy fine of €746 million handed to Amazon in 2021. That's all for today. We'll be back day after tomorrow with more news. If you'd like to see more in-depth analysis, consider supporting us on Patreon so we can grow and expand.